My guest is here. I want to have a conversation with him because I'm super curious on what happens after the war. We are joined with Alex Krainer, my man. He is founder of Krainer Analytics and creator of iSystem Trend Following. He has worked as market analyst, researcher, trader, hedge fund manager since 1996. He has authored several books, including Mastering Uncertainty in Commodities Trading, The Grand Deception, Alex Krainer's Trend Following Bible. I'm sorry, I don't know what the hell is going on upstairs. Alex, how you doing, man? You doing okay this morning?
Doing well, thank you, Thomas.
Afternoon for you, I should say.
Yeah, it is afternoon for me.
Thank you for joining. By the way, what part of the world are you in?
I'm based in Monaco. That's
France.
South,
is that France?
south,
Italy?
South of France. So, yeah, very close to Italy, but it's surrounded by France.
From my understanding, south of France.
It's not a democratic country.
I see.
From
my understanding, it's gorgeous.
It's a sane place.
It's a sane place. Unlike the hell that is taking place in America right now, where there are riots.
No, not just America. Don't think you're special. You know, it's the West in general. Europe is quite an asylum as well.
Europe has become a basket case. I will be honest with you. I've been shocked by what I've been seeing out of Europe.
Yes, it is shocking. It is shocking.
Yeah. For some reason, I consider Europe to be the conscience of America. Maybe I was deluded in that. But yeah, it's just been wild. I am curious on something about Europe, though. From my point of view, the Europeans effectively want to keep this war going, even though it has been damaging their economies. It's clear as day. Germany is being deindustrialized. The Volkswagen, I believe, has been either laying off people or at the very least paying people to retire early because it's not getting the money and funding they would typically get. The amount that they're paying for energy has effectively gone up, which made everything else go up. And some companies can't keep going. And yet, like the little engine that could, Europe continues to keep puttering along, even though it knows that if the U.S. pulls out, it can't carry this on their own. And even these plans to apparently fight the Russians, which seems to be the angle that they're going with, seems to be fraught with political challenges and economic challenges. I am curious, though, at some point this war will stop, whether it's over the table or whether it's on the battlefield. Who is going to foot the bill for Ukraine? And what is Europe's, and maybe let me break this into two parts. Who is going to foot the bill for Ukraine, one? And what is Europe's financial interest in this? I mean, or do they have a financial interest in this? And I guess I can ask the same thing about America. But what is the financial realities that is driving this conflict? Or are there financial realities? Is this just purely geopolitical?
Okay, so you asked a lot of very
That's too many questions. Let me boil that down because I'm sorry.
I know, but they're definitely very, very good questions. I would just, before I say anything about anything, just to clarify, when you say Europe, we can't be talking about some monolith. We need to be talking about the European governing structures, about the let's call it the ruling establishment, which is now a profoundly undemocratic establishment. The democracy, for all practical purposes, has been and is being cancelled. The Europeans only get to vote for let's call it vetted and acceptable candidates. If the wrong candidate wins, well, then they descend down with lawfare and cancel election or engage in some other kind of administrative subterfuge so that the will of the people is essentially sorted. Majority of Europeans don't want to have anything whatsoever to do with this war in Ukraine. So your question is excellent in the sense that what's the financial incentive for it? Because obviously, it's not about freedom and democracy. It's certainly not about human rights of Ukrainians or Europeans or the Russians for that matter. It's about money, but it's not just about, the military industrial complex getting profitable market deals. It goes far, far beyond that. And, to explain that, keep in mind that the natural resource wealth of Ukraine was estimated at between 10 and 12 trillion dollars. The natural resource wealth of Russia has been estimated at between 75 and 90 trillion. Now, that's in Russia, right? So what does that have to do with the Europeans? It doesn't have to do with me or with any ordinary European citizen. It has to do with European banking establishments, generally Western banking establishments, because American banks are just as involved. So the dark magic of the way the banking systems work is that they grow by issuing credit. That is, every time they lend money, that loan becomes an asset on their balance sheets, right? So the more loans they issue, the bigger their balance sheet. And then these loans are all profit generating assets, because you have to pay it back with interest. So it means you're servicing the loan, you're always paying interest to the bank. So it's a form of rentier income against money that they pull out of thin air. But the problem is that in order for them to issue loans, they need collateral to secure the loans, right? And so in any domestic economy, there comes a point when you've saturated the market with debt. Let's say if you were earning $100,000 a year, you could get a loan from the bank, but they wouldn't give you a $10 million loan. They might give you a $100,000 loan or $500,000 loan, but not $1 million or 10 million or $1 billion, right? Because you don't have sufficient income and you don't have, your possessions are not sufficiently valuable for them to secure the risk in lending you the money, right? They need to have something to repossess.
With one exception, if my last name is Hunter Biden, then I can get that $10 million. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So there's
bad.
Bad joke.
There's
a lot of froth around that. But like in essence, they need in order to issue loans, they need collateral. And so once they've saturated the domestic economy, and then the only way to keep growing your balance sheet is by lowering your credit standards, right? To be making increasingly risky loans, against increasingly questionable collateral. And so for them, the mentioned $12 trillion in Ukrainian natural resource wealth and $75 trillion in Russian natural resource wealth is a very, very lucrative source for their growth. So that would be tremendous amount of collateral on the basis of which they could then grow their balance sheets, issue massive new loans, and then become very, very profitable. And then, you also have this thing called the fractional reserve lending, which means that basically if you for every dollar that's in circulation, you could issue as much debt as you like, practically, because the reserve requirement since the COVID crisis in the United States has been 0%. So the banks don't need to hold any reserves against the loans they issue. So how does that work? Your balance sheet grows if you make loans to your client. So if I'm Citigroup, my clients are probably companies like ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, KBR, Halliburton, these kinds of multinational corporations. So if they get contracts to develop, let's say, oil and gas resources in Russia, then they're going to need very large loans to do that. So I'm going to lend them money. And then, if I give $1 billion loan to ExxonMobil, that loan now becomes an asset on my book. And now I have another $1 billion on my balance sheet. So I'm growing. What's necessary to do that is you have to gain political control of the target countries. So, that's all very nice, except the Russians might have something to say about that. They might say, like, we have banks here and we have our corporations that can develop that
Right.
perfectly well. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
No deal here. So then you need to move in by force. So you need to either stage a color revolution, assassinate the leader. You need to put some kind of a government in that country that's friendly to you, that's going to be facilitating all that business. And so that's where you get the incentive to foment regime changes, coups, assassinations, or if nothing else works, military conquest. You need to take down the country by force. So they've done that in Ukraine in 2014. They've staged a coup, and so
Right.
from 2014 on, the government in Kiev has been aligned with the West, which means the gates are open to Western corporations, which means big business for Western banks. And then, not to exonerate the corporations, because they are the very much visible arm of the Western imperialism. They go there, they develop. They generally, there's a lot of abuse involved. Crackdown on labor movements. Frequent assassination of union leaders, things like that. And then obviously they are not known for paying good wages, and they're not known for keeping their employees very, very happy. So this is labor is a very important component of that, because the harder you can exploit them, the more profitable your operations are there, and then the more money you can pay back to your banker. And so that is where the source of conflict comes from. This is where you have the clash between two sides, but the banking aspect is not visible, and for any corporation, for any business, in fact, they tend to run their business within what's feasible and what's within the legal framework, meaning that the corporation itself doesn't have a strong incentive to go abroad and look for business on that basis. They could just as easily buy crude oil from Russian companies. Russian companies export, ExxonMobil imports it, buys it off them, and then puts on their margin and resells that, or refines it, distributes it in their own markets in Western Europe, United States, or wherever else they're present.
Right.
So there's no need for them to go into conquest. Furthermore, as far as ExxonMobil, and I'm speaking about ExxonMobil as a thing. It could be
As an
any
example. Right.
Yeah. ExxonMobil doesn't really care whether the $1 billion loan comes from JP Morgan or Citigroup, or whether it comes from Gazprom Bank or some Chinese bank. It's all the same to them, The only segment in our economies, and it's a very narrow segment, for whom this colonialism, this imperialism is a zero-sum game, is the banking cartel. Because if some natural resource is collateral on Gazprom Bank's balance sheet, then it's not on JP Morgan's balance sheet. It's either theirs or it's ours.
Right.
So where corporations could adapt themselves and do business on whatever basis is feasible and acceptable and sustainable, they would adapt to that and they would do business on that basis. But the bankers get zero from any resource that they don't control, that isn't on their that isn't their collateral. So they are the ones who are generally always, and I'm not talking just about the United States today, I'm talking about the last few centuries of European history, what we call Western civilization, right? It's always been the money-lending oligarchies that have fomented and instigated colonization, enslavement, imperialism all around the world. And in the process, we wiped out 6 major indigenous civilizations, and we've wiped out countless tribes and smaller kingdoms and cultures and peoples everywhere around the world. There used to be a native population in Tasmania. There's not a single person left. We wiped them out. We've reduced the population of Australian Aborigines by between 90 and 95%, not to speak of Native Americans, South America, Middle America, North America. It's been a very, very ugly process, this thing that we call Western civilization. And I think that it's now becoming clear why that is. There's always a justification that's propagandized to the public.
Right.
They used to call people around the world savages, and then the white man had to come and civilize them and show them the ways of progress and all these wonderful things. And then when that story started to wear thin, now we have freedom and democracy and human rights and stuff like that. But these are just let's call it justifications for something that, if people understood correctly, no American, no European would ever tolerate that. You can see that what's being done to the Palestinians now has caused practically a cultural shift, where before people were supportive of Israel. Now that those ranks are wearing very thin as well. So people do have a conscience, and they do have a value system, and they do have they are in touch with their basic humanity. But the bankers don't care. So they put themselves in control of the media. They tell us tall tales and children's stories about what we're doing around the world. And meanwhile, the business is very ugly. I mean, the Dutch Empire, for example, they would.
Oh yes.
They would.
Leopold Soliloquy.
Exactly. They would take some Spice Island there in the Pacific, because they wanted to grow whatever cloves, nutmeg for European markets. And of course, the natives then thought, like, I'm sorry, like this is our place. You're not going to be telling us, So they would just slaughter the whole population of the island, all of them, and then bring slaves from Africa to work their plantations. And they did this. Yeah, they did this not once. So this is how we depopulated much of the world, the Western civilization. And these things are now starting to become clear, but not only to us, the public. They're starting to become clear at the receiving end, across Africa and the global South. The Chinese understood this, the Russian understood this, the Indians have understood this. And so now there's a real pushback. Once you're aware of how the parasite operates, then you can build your immune system. And I think that this is why this is now such a huge. It's a beginning of a massive transition, because we're breaking with probably last 5 or 6 centuries of continuity, during which you had an undisputed primacy of the West. And now this is starting to crumble.
Can I try to repeat that? Meaning, can I try to frame that in my words? Because I want to make sure I understand it, and you can correct me if I get something wrong.
Yes, of course.
It sounds like you're saying that capitalism gets to the water's edge, and it keeps going. All right, we've exploited all the resources we can here. We've done everything that we could. And so a bank would say, okay, so we need more. And we can go to another country to get that more. And if there's somebody who's on that territory, let's say you have oil, gas, minerals, whatever they have that we can effectively exploit, a company will come to the bank, and the company would say, hey, we need a loan in order to exploit the resources of that territory, to which the bank is more than happy to give. But in order to do that, the bank at the very least needs, let's say, a military to take it if the people aren't willing to give it. This goes economic hitman, right? And
Correct.
So you get the government, who's paid a lot of money by business owners, banks, the wealthy, to effectively push that agenda, to go to those locations, overthrow those governments. And once that government is overthrown or pacified, at this point now, the companies can come in and those companies will require loans from banks. So banks can put that on their balance sheet as an asset. Am I getting it right? I just want to make sure I got that right. That's the connection.
Yeah. Exactly. That's
Okay.
ballpark very much right. I would correct you that the banks don't say we need more. They say we want more because they don't need more. We could arrange our monetary system in a different way. The way it's arranged now is that unless it's growing, it becomes very unstable. So it's only,
Right.
it's almost like a bicycle. Unless you're pedaling forward, you fall off. So the problem is that when the bank issues you a loan, let's say they give you $100,000, well, you're going to have to pay that back with interest, whatever amount that is. But let's say if it's a typical mortgage, you're going to end up paying it twice, right? So they lend you $100,000, you're going to be paying back $200,000, except only the principal went into circulation. They credited your account by the amount of the principal. The interest amount never went into circulation. So how are you going to earn back 100,000 plus interest to service your loan?
It's future profits.
You're going to have to earn it from other people. You're going to have to do business, get a job, second job, third job. You're going to have to earn that money to be able to pay back your bank. Now, the only way for the extra $100,000 to enter circulation so that you're even able to earn it is by other people or governments or companies taking on loans so that money enters into circulation. Let's say company XYZ gets a big loan, they hire you, you earn money. So in order for people to be able to service their loans, the system has to continually grow, right?
You're saying it's forced.
Like a massive Ponzi scheme.
You're saying it's forced. They have to do it. Like, meaning, if this market is saturated, the only way I can really pay that loan off is if that bank or more money is getting into circulation. And the only way more money can get into circulation is if the banks or governments are exploiting more resources, which is going to take them abroad by definition. They have to do it.
Yeah, exactly. But you see, this is not, they don't really have to. They could choose to do business on a different basis. And I'll give you a different example.
Please.
Up until about 15 years ago, one of the greatest economic successes was Germany. It was the number one exporting superpower in the world. The value of their exports was even greater than China's until, 10, 15 years ago. And, people know about German products like Mercedes and BMW and, things like this. But the bulk of German exports were companies you never heard about. That they're like basically small and medium-sized businesses that specialized in some kind of an obscure widget that goes into some other widget that then you buy as a finished product as part of I don't know what, So a lot of these exporting companies out of Germany were what you would call market champion. And market champion was defined as is defined as a company that occupies first, second, or third position in terms of market share in the world. Okay, so Germany had 1,200 market champions about 15 years ago.
Are you serious?
Yeah, and the distant second was the United States with about 250 market champions. Now, how did that happen? We get all these children's tales about excellent German engineering and hardworking, disciplined Germans, blah, blah, blah. That's not the explanation. The explanation was in the German banking system, because German banking traditionally has always been literally thousands of small local and regional banks that would support local, small, and medium-sized companies. And they would, it wasn't unheard of for banks to issue 100-year loans to their clients in Germany,
Wow.
and then provide them all kinds of. So imagine if you were an entrepreneur and you knew you could do something. You could build some widget of your own and sell it to the world. And then you talk to your local banker and you say, I need $1 million. And they say, well, okay, Jamal, we know you. You're a clever, responsible guy. You're hardworking. You're from a good family. All right, we'll give you $1 million. And then not only that, they would be intimately involved with the growth of the business. They would frequently visit, tour the facilities, give advice, financial and economic advice, encourage them to go to fairs. If you had a 100 million loan, that means you had all kinds of maneuvering space to develop your business, overcome the childhood diseases of the business, develop it slowly without slaving to the imperative of quarterly earnings and profits. And you could develop your business over the long term. And then in the second generation, people would send their kids to study whatever, chemistry, engineering, whatever they were doing. And then the kids would come back with new ideas and new knowledge about how to advance, refine, perfect their production process and marketing and all of these things. And that's how Germany, from the bottom up, incubated these 1,200 market champions, which made Germany a superpower in terms of export in the world. Now, this is thanks to the funding that they obtained from local, regional banks, 70% of which were non-profit institutions. So these banks were not in it for big, giant, massive profits. They were operating pretty much as a public utility, allocating credit to productive industries in their regions. So, there's no reason why a banking system in any country couldn't operate that way. This rapacious colonialist approach that we have in certain Western countries ruled by the too big to fails is a choice. They choose to do this. They don't have to. They want to, and they choose to do this. And now you have to ask yourself, why on earth are they choosing this? It's evil. It's immoral.
Profits.
It's making the world into the hell that it is everywhere. And it's not just exploiting brown people around the world. It's exploiting the domestic populations as well. Because if you look at, this started, already with the Venetians, and if you study history of the way things were back then, Spanish Empire, when they were hauling in hundreds, thousands of tons of gold and silver from South America, well,
Right.
people in Spain were miserable and poor. Victorian England, same. If you read Charles Dickens novels, you realize that, that was the British Empire in its zenith, but the British people in Britain were living in a very miserable way. Upton Sinclair, his writings about the United States around the same time, it was miserable. And now we see that, we had a good period in the post-World War II era, right? But we see that all of those things are deteriorating, and we see growth in poverty, growth in homelessness, drug addiction. So all of those Dickensian, qualities of society are making a comeback, and it's always this one and the same system that we're talking about, which is basically misery at home and mayhem abroad.
And that's what we're seeing now in the
That's what
conflict
we're seeing
in
now.
Europe.
Yes, exactly. In the United States and in Europe and in Canada, to a good extent, maybe not uniformly, but Alberta is a resource-rich country, so province, so things look a bit brighter there. But you go elsewhere, you see the same thing as you see in the United States cities. Britain is a horrible basket case, and is basically the birthplace of this system. well, no, it's not a birthplace, but it's the birthplace of its modern
Equivalent.
yeah, exactly. The birthplace is maybe, the Roman Empire, or maybe Greece of antiquity.
So that answers the question. Why would governments, when they can see themselves failing and declining economically because of their behavior, continue the behavior? And I think your point is, well, from their point of view, everything that the entire economic model on some level demands them, or at the very least incentivizes them to do it that way, because that is the way they've done it for decades or for centuries at this point. So they have to get the resources of Ukraine, which they did. They have to get the resources of Russia. It's $70 trillion. It would effectively pay back all of the investment that they've dumped into it. In fact, if they could have gotten their hands on Russia, it would have easily paid back like 10 times, 20 times over what they've invested into it. But they didn't get their hands on Russia.
Yeah, that's right. Because
that's the issue, right?
The damn Russians won't give us their won't let us have our resources, which are rightfully ours.
Right. The Russians just so happen to be born in the wrong place.
Exactly. But and then you could the same story holds for Iran and for the Middle East in general, and any part of the world. And once you digest this, once you understand the core principle behind it, you realize to what extent everything else is just peddling narrative and propaganda. When you look at Iran and they're talking about the nuclear deal, no nuclear deal, enrichment, no enrichment, whether the mullahs are bad or good, or state sponsor of terror, all of this nonsense, none of it is relevant in the slightest. That is all just for public consumption. It is all just to give themselves the justification and a pretext to take down the government if they can. Everything else is just fluff and foam and a hollow story. It's always about the resources, and it's only about the resources, which includes the local population, because the resources won't get themselves over to us. Somebody has to dig them up. Somebody has to do the work. So you need to enslave the population as well.
Does Trump know that? And does political leaders know that? I mean, look, some of these people are neocons. Some of these people, I agree with everything that has just come out of your mouth. I am blown away by how succinct you've been able to explain that. Some of these people are neocons, and they have an ideological worldview that incentivizes them to behave a particular way. But do they know that? Like when they are in the political space?
I don't think that they do, Jamal. I don't think that they do. The people who do know it is a high-level military personnel, usually after they've served their terms, and they realize, very strange. If you read Smedley Butler's
War's a Racket,
he figured it out, but after a lifetime of serving them, and then he said, I've been I forget the exact words, but he says I've been serving the bankers' interests.
Yep.
And then I spoke with Glenn Deason last week, and he told me that in the meantime he has met a person who worked their whole career for British intelligence, and this person told me the whole thing is just about collateral. That's it. And so people at high level of intelligence agencies,
they know it.
High level of military brass, they understand because they work it out. Of course, they're never told these. Like the bankers don't come and they tell them, hey, clear out Middle East for me because there's lots of oil there, and I want that on my balance sheets. They tell them, free trade, human rights, democracy, freedom, blah, 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 and they recruit and select people for being dumb to buy that bullshit, right?
Yeah.
They don't select for high intellectual capacity. And you can see that, they put people like Justin Trudeau and Keir Starmer and Ursula von der Leyen and Kaja Kallas. And you can see that these people have low IQ. I mean, at room temperature level, they're really dumb. They don't understand anything, and they are seduced by these stories about progress and human rights and all these nice things, and maybe they never figure it out. I think it's the people who actually dirty their hands and bloody their hands with the actual work who end up traumatized by it enough that they say, like, why are we doing this? And then they have to work out an answer for themselves. And then they realize, holy shit, we're always fighting for the resources. Why? We can, you don't need to have a military base in the Middle East to have oil. You can just buy it from countries that export it, right? It's what every other country does. Switzerland doesn't have military bases around the world. They still have oil at their gas pumps, right? They just trade for it. The United States could do the same. Britain could do the same, but it's the bankers who need political control of these nations in order to, by magic of their fraudulent monetary system, to turn other nations' resources into their assets. That's the magic, and that's the whole reason for everything.
You pointed out that other countries are becoming aware of it. That basically the global south, Russia, China, in fact, these countries that were exploited, China suffered 100 years of humiliation. They said never again. Russia suffered through the Yeltsin era. Again, never again. You get the global south that has started to, I'm saying grow up. I don't mean this as if they're children. I just mean economically become more robust. You get Africa, especially Sahel states, that have decided to come together saying, why are we poor? I think that was one of the most fascinating things from Ibrahim Traore. And it's so radically self-aware, right? It's like we have the most resources probably than anywhere else in the globe. And yet we are poor. We don't even have roads. Exactly. How does this work?
After a whole century of colonization, they're still poor.
Yeah.
And, we, the sanctimonious Europeans, we never hesitate to lecture them about corruption and rule of law and all of this nonsense. We have been keeping them poor deliberately. And you know why? Because if they grew rich, they might absorb their own resources in their own economies.
Exactly.
So we want them to not have any nuclear power stations. We want them to not have any gold refineries, oil refineries. We don't want them to drive cars. We just want them to extract all that stuff for us. So they have to remain poor. And then, when people are poor and uneducated, then they're much easier to control as well.
Yeah. What happens when that process stops, when that wheel breaks? Because it seems like, as you pointed out, that wheel, I don't think people in Europe knows what you just said. I don't think people in the US knows what you just said. I don't think they have any awareness of it. The people in the global south.
No, because nobody will tell you, Jamal. It took me 40 years to work it out. Do you know when I started obsessing about this?
What, during the Iraq War?
No, back in the mid 1980s, because I was 16 years old. Sting went to the Brazilian rainforest to save the natives and the rainforest, to raise awareness about what's going on there, because they were cutting it down, for whatever, for timber, for planting soybean fields and so forth. Yeah. And back then I was 16, and I read stories about Sting's activism, but intuitively I knew that everything he was doing there was futile, because this has been centuries of Western conquest and subjugation, colonialism, and so forth. And I thought, there's something very, very powerful behind all this. What is it? And I thought, if I speak to an American, if I speak to a German person, a British person, they're not pathologically greedy, evil people who are ready to kill you to take your stuff. They're human beings like you and I, like any African person, like any Russian, Chinese person. So it's not in the people. So we couldn't just say like, oh, Brits are bad, so let's just get rid of Brits and everything's going to be fine. It had to be something systemic. But there are no textbooks to explain you this. I studied economics. I was the big geek who graduated with almost all. Like I try to learn my shit.
Yeah.
Nobody tells you, and in fact, they deliberately leave some pieces of the puzzle missing, so you can never really get the big picture. I worked 15 years as a hedge fund manager, and your job as a hedge fund manager is to try to figure out how the world works, so you know how to invest and how to not get killed. And so you would spend 4, 5, 6 hours a day reading shit, papers and books and articles, and listen to interviews and lectures and go to conferences and talk to people. And it took me literally my lifetime to kind of come to this conclusion. But once you come to this conclusion, and once you realize what they've been hiding from us
Can't unsee
forever, you start seeing it everywhere. Like every story you read now, you will see like, yes, okay, this is what's going on. And things become a lot more predictable and a lot less mysterious, because they always tell us, oh, these centuries old hatred, these people went against these people because they can't stand each other. Or they tell you that in history, Napoleon went to conquer Russia because of his own ego. He wanted to build a big empire. Excuse me, who paid for his army? That's kind of a big army.
Right.
That's kind of a big army and a very major undertaking. Who paid for it? Where did he come up with the money for that? They never tell you these things. It's always about, oh, this country was aggressive. Oh, this general was very ambitious. Oh, this king had a massive ego. No, it's always the money-lending oligarchies that co-opt the whole political process, and that tell the politicians, this is what we want. We're going to lend you money. We're going to give you money, but we need this. You need to go to war against the Dutch or the Spanish or the French or whoever. So, that's where it's all at, and we will never transcend this until we reform the monetary system.
Well, for that to happen, someone has to lose, and lose significantly.
Well, the inbred degenerates of this world who are stirring the pot nonstop for centuries, they have to lose. Well, tough shit,
Yeah. Well, no, I don't mean that as a negative. I actually mean that as a positive. I mean,
right.
Someone has to break the wheel. Like the wheel just can't keep going. At some point, it has to break.
We can't keep going like this.
Who pays for Ukraine? I mean, if Europe didn't get what they needed out of Russia because Russia effectively kicked ass, who pays for that? I think
that in the end they're gonna be fleecing European taxpayers in one way or another. They're gonna be pitching these bonds. They're probably going to be issuing bonds. And since nobody in the world is going to be interested in any of these bonds, they're going to be forcing them on people's pension funds. They're going to create legal incentives and monetary incentives for pension funds and insurance companies and all of this whole shadow banking system to kind of coerce them to buy these bonds. And so what's going to happen, they're going to take the pension pot of the European people and they're going to buy these bonds, and that money is going to be shoveled towards the military-industrial complex, towards Ukraine, towards Vladimir Zelensky cocaine habit, and everything that's required to keep the war going.
What happens when that wheel breaks? I was watching, I was reading, I guess I was watching a graph. I'm not sure if that sounds right. I was looking at a graph by Pickney, I believe his name is, an economist. And he was showing how it was extractive capitalism, basically the way that colonies were extracting resources from South America, from Africa, from these places that impoverished those countries. And that if it wasn't for that extractive capitalism, and I'm saying extract capital, but that extractive relationship between these two, that Europe would have been a debtor nation. The US would have been a debtor nation. I mean, it is now, but it would have been much worse. And that it was only because of the colonial relationship between these countries that Europe was able to effectively have more wealth, more gold, and these countries ended up being as poor as they are. What happens when that wheel is broken and that process of go to that country because that country now is strong enough to withstand you from going to that country, and you have to effectively deal with your countries at its water's edge? What happens to these countries, Europe and the US, under that model?
Well, that's exactly the most interesting part of everything, Jamal, because we don't know. It's a blank sheet, and if we, if we arm ourselves with knowledge and understanding and a general idea of what we want out of life, then we can fill out that page.
Yeah.
We can devise any kind of social arrangement that we want, any kind of monetary system that makes sense, so long as we know what we're doing. If we don't know what we're doing, they're always going to slip in their experts and advisors who are going to tell us, oh, you don't worry about it, we'll take care of it. We know how the money system works. We know how banking works. We're just going to set it all up for you, start from a blank slate, and then start the same wheel of history from scratch that always goes in the predictable direction of, again, exploitation and colonialism and imperialism and allocating massive amounts of society's wealth to the military-industrial complex for security, things like that, for our own good, or else we can demand solutions that suit what ordinary humans want, which is not complicated either. We want a peaceful, prosperous life. We want our children to be happy.
Yeah.
We want hang out with our neighbors, to travel, stuff,
Basic things.
basic ordinary things. But we're going to have to take an active part. And the United States is now in a place where it could start making that transition, but it's going to have to. American people are going to have to continue to pressure their governments to deliver what the people want, and to not deliver what people don't want. Because one of the strange things about this democracy is that people want safe streets and prosperity and good jobs and vacation time and all these nice things, but somehow we can never afford that.
Right.
And all these things that people don't want, like wars and military bases and the big control matrix grid, well, somehow we can afford all that.
Yep.
And we have a democracy, by the way, so
I think that's just what they call it.
yeah.
Alex, man, this was a fantastic breakdown. I swear.
Thank you very much.
Distinct, spot on, and explained it in a way that the audience could understand it. We have nearly 3,000 people here live streaming, watching. I mean,
awesome. Hello, 3,000 people.
I know, right? They were like, wow, what is this? Thank you for this, man. I really appreciate it. Alex Krainer.
My pleasure, Jamal. Always good to join you. Greetings to all your viewers and listeners, and until the next time.
You have a good one, man. You be safe. Alex Krainer, he's founder of Krainer Analytics. Bye-bye. And creator of iSystems Trend Following. He has worked as a market analyst, researcher, trade, hedge fund manager since 1996. He has authored several books, including Mastering Uncertainties in Commodities Trading, The Grand Deception, and Alex Krainer's Trend Following Bible. That was a fantastic breakdown. Thank you for this. You be safe.
Take care. Bye.